Hi, and welcome to my theory presentation on the dual coding theory. To begin, I'd first like to give an overview of the dual coding theory and what all it involves or suggests. So essentially, the dual coding theory suggests that information is processed and stored by the human brain through two distinct channels. Those channels are verbal and visual. The idea is that these two channels work together, and when done so correctly, information is more likely to be remembered and understood than if the information were to be presented in only one format, so only verbally or only visually. So on this slide, for example, I've placed visuals on the screen to help reinforce my words and promote retention. I'm igniting both the verbal and visual channels of your brain. This is the dual coding theory in practice at this very moment. To be specific, verbal channels involve spoken or written words, and visual channels refer to pictures, graphs, diagrams, visual aids, mental images, things of that nature. So, images. So, what does this mean? Let's break it down. I'm going to say a few words to you and test you to see how many you can recall. And yes, I know you're watching a video presentation, but play along and pause the video if you need to. Okay, here are the words. House, coffee, boat, dog, clock. How many of these words can you repeat back to me? How easy do you find your recall to be? Wait 30 seconds. Try again. Ask yourself that again. How easy did you find the recall system to be? Now let's try a different approach. Car, book, cat, glasses, flower. Ask yourself the same question again. How many of these words can you repeat back to me? How easy did you find your recall to be in this situation? Wait 30 seconds and try again. Now, hopefully you were able to recall more or even find it easier to recall the second group of words than the first group. Can you even remember any of the words I said in the first group? That's the dual coding theory. So I did this to show you that this is the premise of the dual coding theory, that when verbal cues are paired with visual aids, both the verbal and visual channels of your brain are both engaged. This allows the brain to form two types of mental representations of the same information. This strengthens understanding and recall and is more effective for learning than just using one channel alone. So now that we have a general understanding of what the dual coding theory is, let's take a step back to reflect on how it came to be. The primary researcher who developed the dual coding theory is named Allan Pavio. Now, Allan Pavio earned his PhD in psychology and worked for over 40 years researching the interconnectedness of images, memory, language, and understanding. He is widely known for developing the dual coding theory in the 1960s, and his work emphasizes the dual systems of verbal and visual processing in the brain and how they work together to improve memory and learning in specific, so long-term learning as well. Pavio's research studies looked at how verbal and visual processing interact with elements such as how fast information is presented and how quickly you can recall that information, and the type of memory task being used, so deeper understanding or simple recall. We looked at it all. Pavio created this diagram to showcase the dual coding theory. It shows how a human mind processes and stores information through the two channels we've discussed, verbal and visual, but in this diagram, it's visual. It's referred to as nonverbal, as you can see here. The left side of the diagram shows the verbal system, which processes logogens. That just means spoken or written words. While the right side of the diagram shows a system that processes nonverbal or visual image-based information. This can be either mental pictures or visual representation. So it can be either when I say apple, you think of an apple, or when I say apple, well, I guess when I'm mixing both when I'm saying it, but it could be a picture of an apple or a mental image of an apple. So when you mix them together, like saying apple and showing an apple, these systems are working together. Now, they can work and function independently, but they do often function together to enhance learning and memory. And when both of these systems are working together to store memories in two different forms, this makes recall easier and forms a greater, stronger connection than if the systems were working alone. And this is why adding visuals to verbal or written information can help learners to understand and remember content better. In one of his initial studies, Pavio looked at how images interfere with processing different types of words. Words referred to as concrete or more noun-type words versus abstract words. Sometimes they're referred to as adjective-type words, but like truth and love, for example, are not adjectives, as you see on the screen. He tested the idea of pairing these types of words together in different ways to see how well people could remember the second word based on the first word. So he's trying to associate concrete words with visual images in your head. He found that the word that came first in each pair acted as a sort of, quote, conceptual peg that helps us to remember the second word. So basically, when learning a pair of words, people would more often use the first word to trigger a recall of the second word. And his theory is that it is because the first word, a concrete word, allows your brain to think of a specific image. So he's tying the two channels together. Because he found that when this recall worked the best, when the first word was a concrete image-evoking word, such as a house, in comparison to an abstract word, such as truth or love, that doesn't really evoke a specific image in the brain. So, what can we do with this information? Well, we can use it to guide our instructional messaging to make it as effective as possible. This includes utilizing both verbal and visual channels to convey information. As we've learned, this supports the processing of the same information in two different ways and ultimately leads to higher retention. In practical application, you can encourage learners to create their own visuals to represent verbal or written information. This can mean having learners create an infographic or a map based on content. One thing I found interesting when researching the dual coding theory was how the use of mnemonic devices provided a sort of seed idea that Pavio used to grow the dual coding theory. I'm thinking of like the silly sentences we would make when we're trying to memorize the order of the planets. And while mnemonic devices do help with recall, they lack the visual aspect that the dual coding theory incorporates. I think that having learners associate content with their own images, maybe like memorizing vocabulary terms or historical moments by creating their own visually represented flashcards, could prove to boost understanding and retention because they're creating their own visual mnemonic device. Another way is to place relevant visuals and text together. So rather than separating words and their corresponding visuals, you could place them close together to encourage greater association. Think of it this way. Have you ever had someone try to explain to you how to play a new board game without demonstrating anything, without showing you anything at all? It's confusing. So by linking words with visuals, the impact on understanding is exponentially greater. Finally, we can make sure that the visuals you choose to include are relevant and support your verbal content. Now, this goes along with the cognitive load theory too, but it definitely has a place here. So visuals should directly align with the verbal content being presented. Even when the content is abstract, something like eyesight, it's important to keep the visuals relevant and not random or just not associated with the word at all. It's also important to make sure that the visuals are not a distraction. It's important to avoid images that create unnecessary noise or cause the learner to stray away from the core of the content. And again, this goes with other theories, but it does have its place here. So for example, the word we're trying to remember on this slide is car, but I have a feeling that's not what will be most memorable about this slide. If anything, it's probably the word crash. So to add to the examples I've already listed, I wanted to add a specific instructional example that aligns with everything I've discussed. So these are lit letters made by Lit to Lead. And to quote their website, these flashcards are innovative, research-backed cards that use an embedded pictograph mnemonic strategy to make learning letter sounds fun, intuitive, and effective for young learners. I find these cards amazing and honestly directly in line with the dual coding theory, whether they know it or not. When thinking about alternative versions of letter-based flashcards, I can see why they wouldn't be as effective, like linking a B to a baby or X to a xylophone, because they're not really associated with the shape at all. Lit letters matches the shape of the letter with the visual on the card. This is not only giving a letter association with the word, like H is for horse, but the horse displayed is also in the shape of an H. This encourages learners to go beyond just the absorption of the visual of the letter itself to create a legitimate visual representation. So when the visual isn't directly in front of them, like they're not looking at the horse on the flashcard, they're just looking at a letter H on the page, their recall ability to know that it's a letter H is higher. And this is the dual coding theory hard at work. I think it's so cool. Okay, so that is all I have for today. Thank you for listening. I'm going to move one slide forward just to show my sources, but other than that, I am done. Thank you again.